So you're back with Outward Home Learning. The subject we're looking at is computer science, and today's topic is IDEs, or Integrated Development Environment. Now, these come up in exam questions all the time. It's one of those things you've got to know about, so we're going to go over to Mr. Holton to explain them.
When you decide to write some computer code, you've got a choice. You're faced with a choice straight off the bat, and that is, how am I going to write it? Am I going to write it in an integrated development environment, or am I going to write it in a text editor? And really the only sensible option is an integrated development environment, and I'm going to go over the features that an IDE has, that's what it stands for, over a text editor and why you should probably use it, and compare the two. But let's just talk about a text editor first, because I want to show you that it is possible to write code in a text editor. Here's an example of one right now. So this is Notepad in Windows. You might be very familiar with it. I'm just going to write some code. So let's have some Python. So print hello world, and then let's have my num equals, I'm going to make a deliberate mistake here, and I'll see if you can spot it. Enter a number. There you go. And so I've written some computer code. If I wanted to then run that program, I'd have to go through a whole sequence of steps to make that happen. So I would have to feed it into a translator. I would have to run it in a separate window. It would take a little bit of time for me to actually run that computer program. And that's something to bear in mind as we go and have a look at an IDE, which we're going to have a look at now. So here is Thonny. Let's let's just copy and paste that code over. And Thonny is an example of an IDE for the Python programming language, and it immediately helps us out, and I'll go into sort of the reasons why. But let's just cover some of the basics of what an IDE provides, and then read the basic thing is it provides an editor. This is one and the only thing it shares with a simple text editor like Notepad. That editor lets you edit the code or change the code, so it lets you type in letters and numbers and things like that. Without an editor and IDE, it would be pretty useless, so an editor is important. And our second feature is this. I'm just going to quickly run this, okay, and it's going to give me a bit of information on the right hand side here. It says name error, name input is not defined, line 2. So it's immediately telling me I've got a problem on line 2, and it's got a problem with this word here, input, okay. That is called error diagnostics. So it's immediately pointing out to me a problem, and that lets me solve problems, usually syntax errors, a lot more quickly, and it gives me a lot more information than a text editor would. Okay, so now I know I've got a problem here. I know that, yeah, I've made a mistake there. That's a capital I. It has to be a lowercase I. And look what happens to the word if I do this. It's gone purple. And there's this thing called syntax highlighting. Because Thonny recognizes input as like a key word, it's a function within Python, it's highlighted it purple. So syntax highlighting is a really useful feature as well. And that just simply, well, colors words in different colors depending on their meaning, and it helps you look at your code and be able to read your code. It makes it more readable. Okay, so we've got editor, error diagnostic, syntax highlighting, but wait, there's more. There's so much more. So this little arrow here, watch what happens when I run my program. So I'm pressing that play button there, and actually an awful lot has just happened in the background. Pressing that play button has just translated the code that we have in Python. It's fed it into an interpreter, and you can have a look at a separate video about translators and how interpreters and stuff like that. But having access to a translator is a key feature of an IDE, so that you can very quickly translate your code into a version that the computer can understand, because obviously computers can't understand words, they understand binary. And the last feature we're going to cover is this thing called a runtime environment in the bottom right hand corner. See this thing called shell here? Okay, so that is, that lets you basically run the program. So we've translated the program by pressing this button, and then the program is instantly run within the IDE itself. You don't have to worry about that happening in a separate window. And that lets us immediately see changes that we've made to our code and how it affects the program when it's run. So I mean, I'll stop there, but there really are sort of IDEs with hundreds of extra features out there. I'm just focusing on a very simple IDE to sort of get across some of the key features that you might have in an IDE. So let's cover them again. So you've got editors, you've got the which lets you edit your code. You've got translators, which lets you translate your code and then run it within the IDE. Being able to run it within the IDE and seeing the results is the runtime environment. You've got syntax highlighting, which highlights keywords or functions in different colors. And finally, error diagnostic. So they give you an indication of where particularly syntax errors are on your code, so you can fix them quickly. And that's IDEs.
So now it's time for your first task. In this task, you're going to be labeling different parts of an IDE. You can use Mr. Holson's video to help you if you need to, and then we'll review the task afterwards. So you've got 10 minutes to do that, and your time starts now. And that is time up. So let's review your answers. We'll go over to Mr. Barnes and then you'll be able to correct anything you didn't get quite right.
Okay, so hopefully you had an opportunity now to complete this activity on IDEs. We're just going to run through it so you can see, what's right and what's not. So we've got 5 different areas of our IDE that can be labelled, which are different features of an IDE. Okay, so let's start with the top right one. So if you can see on yours or on mine, we've got names of different variables here and we've got values next to them. So what you can do is you can trace the value of variables. Okay, alright, and what that allows you to do is see if the variables are storing the values that you expect as you go through, which is really, really important. Okay, so I'm just going to put a tick next to that one. The next one then, if we go down, we've got this thing that says assistant and it's got warnings. Okay, and these are debugging tools. There are other tools as well which allow you to step through a program bit by bit, but the debugger identifies errors and then either gives you suggestions on how to correct them or tells you where they are. Okay, down the bottom then we've got the shell, and the shell in Python is the runtime environment. And what the runtime environment lets you do is it lets you run and test your program without actually needing to compile it. And you'll see in this example here there's an error, which is why we've got some red text. So it's allowed me to find that without having to compile it to find out that problem. And then the last two, they can really be in any order. This is the source code editor, which is where you can edit your code. And there's lots of different things that happen in here. One of them is you get color-coded syntax. And that is really useful because it allows you to see, if you've got speech marks or whatever. And the other one is you can add, although there's not any on this program, comments to explain what's going on, and also indentation. And indentation is really important in Python, but it shows the flow of the code, so it makes it easier to follow what's going on. Okay, so then down the bottom, and I'm going to sort of paraphrase on this a lot because it'll be quicker. It says describe how each of the following features work, and there's one thing that's worth noting. With any IDE, you will have a translator to turn that high-level code into machine code. So that's one of the other features, but we've looked at translators in another lesson. So we've got source code editor. So the key things with source code editor, which is this section up here, okay, is you've got the color coding of command words. Alright, and as I said, that just makes it easier to see, if you've done things correctly. You've got indenting to show the flow of the program. And obviously the source code editor allows editing of the code. Okay, so they're the main things, or the main features of a source code editor. Okay, so the debugger then, which we demonstrated here, it can identify errors, and it tells you like what line and whereabouts it is if you've got a decent IDE, and then it also provides suggestions on how to correct. And again, the level of which it does this depends on how good the IDE is. And as part of the debugger, you can step through a program, so you can walk through it one line at a time and see what the values change to and so on. Runtime environment, as I mentioned, so it creates a test platform that allows you to run and test without the need to compile. Okay, and then finally we've got automation tools. Now, we didn't really talk about them at the top, but automation tools, and some IDEs have them, some don't, they're there to help and support. Okay, so they're there to try and prevent errors being made, and the most obvious one is like code completion. So when you start typing, it gives you suggestions of what command you want or what variable name you want. Idle doesn't really do it that well at all, but other IDEs do. So if, for example, with variables, if you struggle with spelling, you could start typing the name of a variable and it will say what you used for it before, and then you can select the correct variable. So even if you spell it wrong, you'll spell it wrong consistently and your program will work. So they're the key features of an IDE.
Okay, so as ever, it's now time for some exam questions. We'll go over to Mr. Barnes afterwards to review them, but you've got 10 minutes to complete your exam questions. Do the very best you can and review the answers afterwards. Off you go. Okay, time up. So let's review your answers. Again, Mr. Barnes is going to step through these, so make sure you're making any amendments you need to as you go for your revision at a later stage. Over to Mr. Barnes.
Okay, so let's have a little look at these exam questions on IDEs, write some model answers and then refer to the mark scheme. So we've got here, question 1, Joseph is using an integrated development environment, IDE, to produce the program. One tool that Joseph uses is a translator. Okay, describe 2 additional tools that Joseph could use to help him produce his program. So the key thing here is they've already said he uses a translator, so we cannot use that as an answer. Not possible. So we can't write compiler, interpreter, or anything. It's a 4-mark question, and we need 2 tools and 2 descriptions. So we're going to get 2 marks for identifying 2 tools, and we're going to get 2 marks for explaining what they are. So the first one I always go for, I'm going to say a debugger. Okay. And the next tool that I'm going to identify, a source code editor. Okay, because I think these are the easiest to remember and explain. Okay, so now I need my description. So my description for a debugger is it highlights errors in the code, and provides suggestions on how to correct them. Okay, so I've got my identification mark and I've got my description mark. So source code editor, there's a lot of different things I could say here. I'm going to say allows you to type code and color codes key syntax. Okay, so let's have a little look at the mark scheme and see where we get our marks for this. So I'm just going to shuffle this up slightly. That should be enough. So we've got here, it says 1 mark for identification, 1 mark for matching description. So let's do the identification marks first. So first and foremost, we said debugger. Debugger's here, 1 mark. And I've got text editor, source code editor, absolutely fine, 2 marks. So the second mark for the debugger is it highlights errors and suggests changes. Well, highlights errors in the code and suggestions on how to correct them. That is absolutely fine. And then source code editor, we've got allows you to type code and color codes key syntax. So here I've actually overdone it. To type edit source code, yep, and highlight keywords or syntax is there as well. Other things that you're allowed are versioning tools for tracing back, and also stepping or breakpoints, which is allow you to walk through the algorithm and see what's happening. Notice in the mark scheme here it says do not allow compiler or interpreter, and that's because they are types of translator, and that's already in the question. Okay, so let's have a look at the second question then. So it says describe tools and facilities available in an integrated development environment which can help the programmer to identify and correct syntax errors. Okay, so this is really, really important, because here they want features of an IDE specifically for identifying and correcting syntax errors. Okay, it's 4 marks, so it's very similar to the question above. It basically wants 2 tools to be identified with descriptions, okay, but it has to be about identifying and correcting syntax errors. So the first thing I'm going to write is the source code editor can help this, because it allows you to correct code and also highlights syntax. If syntax isn't highlighted, it could signify an error. So like if you write print but you put a capital P, it wouldn't turn purple, for example. So if syntax isn't highlighted, it could mean an error. Okay, so I've identified one, and now I'm going to identify a second one. So I'm going to say that a debugger will tell you where errors are and then provide suggestions on how to fix them. Okay, right, so let's have a little look at the mark scheme. Let's just shuffle that up and have a look at this mark scheme, which is a little bit vague, it has to be said. Okay, so we've got here the source code editor helps because it allows you to correct syntax. So we've got editor, so source code editor helps, allows you to enter corrected code or the correct code and highlight syntax. Perfect. Then I've got the debugger, so error messages / translator diagnostics attempt to tell you where the error is and what the line is. So we've got here, tells you where the errors are, okay, and we've got that it's like a diagnostic to do it. So we've got 4 marks. Okay, it's a bit of a trickier one to mark that because it's not as clear cut, but effectively it's still asking for 2 tools that help with syntax or identifying and correcting syntax errors. Okay.
And that's everything you need to know about IDEs. Make sure you remember it because it always comes up, and we will see you for the next lesson.